One of the major things that makes fantasy stand out from all the other genres is, of course, the magic. So today I thought we would go over 10 things I would like to see more of with magic in our fantasy books. The first thing I want to include on this list I am calling creature magic. And I'm looking at this in two different ways. The first one is that humans just don't have access to it. I think is really interesting when the magic is part of the world and there's this mystical essence that maybe we can't access, but other creatures perhaps can. And that's from humanoid-esque species like elves or something completely different like dragons. But the main point here is that just humans can't access it. As well as this, another possibility of what you could do with the magic system with this kind of setup is having humans only being able to access it through this bond with creatures. We see this a lot in Dragon Rider fantasy books, but why don't we have it with other fantasy creatures? I've only really seen this with Dragon Rider fantasy books, but why can't we get this connection through another type of creature, perhaps many different types? You could do like a Pokemon-esque situation where the world is just filled with these different animals and perhaps you can bond with them and then you can access some of their magic too. But just having it through this more biological connection with different magical species, I just think would be really cool. It also adds a lot of story implications and interests. What if the creature and the person get split up? What happens if they don't agree? Where does all the implications behind those the sort of interpersonal connections fit into it as well? Next on up is more soft magic systems. Now, I love both hard and soft magic systems. For those who don't know what that means, hard is more of a science-based magic where we kind of have all the rules of how the magic works, whereas soft is when it's a little bit more ephemeral and perhaps we don't really understand all the implications of the magic. And like I said, I really like both. I think there's a place for both in fantasy. I don't think one is necessarily better than the other, but recently there has been a lot of hard magic systems coming out in newer fantasy books, so I would just really like to see more softer magic systems right now just kind of coming out so we can get more of a mix. These things always come in trends. If it swings one way so far, we'll definitely swing back and eventually just get a bunch of the other stuff because it just creates this vacuum of unutilized space in the fantasy genre so that authors will feel like, okay, maybe we should try this again or try the complete opposite of what's doing really well now because everybody's getting so much of this one thing. And right now, of course, Brandon Sanderson is one of the biggest names in modern day fantasy and he loves hard magic systems. All his books are kind of built on this one foundational magic. And it's really interesting. And again, I love it. I love Brandon Sanderson's work. I love hard magic systems. There's just a lot of it recently. So I would really like to see more soft magic systems. With soft magic systems, you just get a lot more of this mystical kind of unknown feeling. I think that's what we really long for when we go towards fantasy and kind of this magic element is just wishing that there was more to the world and there is this extra element of magic that's really interesting, this unknown. I think even with hard magic systems, quite often the things that are really interesting with the hard magic systems are the things that are kind of pushing at its limits. Even you can see this with Sanderson's work, is the things that slightly are outliers on this magic spectrum or just the kind of breaks in the rules or how you can utilize these rules and use them in a way that's not necessarily what they're normally used for. I think we just naturally as human beings look for the new and the unknown. And that is pretty much the foundation of soft magic. And kind of going a bit off that as well, I'd love to see more lost and ancient magic. Now this is just one of my favorite tropes when magic is kind of this lost art, this thing that was very common thousands of years ago, but we've kind of lost our knowledge of it and we don't really know how to use it or utilize it, or perhaps some sort of fuel source has diminished over time and it follows these characters going in and learning more about this ancient magic that's woken up. It's just one of those tropes and setups that I personally love so much. We see it in things like Wheel of Time, which of course is a classic in the genre, and more recently we kind of see it a bit in something like The Silver Blood Promise, where there is this strange race of old people that have these strange magical items that we don't really know how they work. And it's just a setup I love. I love the kind of implications. It's like, why did the magic disappear? What can it do when they re-find it? It adds this depth and this history to the world that I just personally love. And if you are a writer or a world builder, I highly recommend checking out the sponsor of this video, Loreforge. So I've been using Loreforge for a couple months now, and I am so impressed with the tools it has for world building and just plotting out and outlining a novel. However, it would also be really good for RPG and kind of any world builders out there. It lets you keep track of characters, species, locations, stories, and it lets you cross-reference all of these different elements. However, by far my favorite part of this is the outlining feature. Not only can you write directly in Loreforge, but I really like the fact that you can summarize chapters, and also the outlining feature, being able to create different branches. Like I said, I've been using it to outline my next novel, and I really like the fact that I can break it down by character or even by acts. And it does actually have a narrative structure on the left-hand side of the screen, which is really cool, just so you can kind of keep that sort of structure in your head while you are outlining. And this is going to sound ridiculous, but having a notes feature is so helpful. There's so many of my ideas that just don't fall into one of these categories, and having a part of the interface just for notes that I can write all these strange little side things that I have in my head is so helpful, and I like it very much. So whether you are a writer or an RPG player or just a world builder, I highly recommend checking out Loreforge. And if you use the link in the description and the code FOOL, you will get the first 30 days completely free. So thank you very much, Loreforge, for sponsoring this video. Magic tools and magic items. Whether this is a conduit for the magic, like a wand or a staff of some kind, or just a completely separate item that has some sort of magic ability built into the item itself, I love all of it. Super cool. Magic swords, gimme gimme. Magic clothing, hell yeah. A magic hat that you put on and it turns you into a separate species, separate being, gimme it all. Again, this just sets up kind of this very interesting story potential, especially with the kind of, if they're separated from their magical item, then they can't access the magic. It can just really bring up the stakes in some of your scenes in your books. And then there's questions of, can everybody use these items? Is there some way to make the item only usable by the one sorcerer? It also does create this kind of mix of soft and hard magic, because yes, the item does one thing or two things, say, but you don't know how many different kinds of items there are, or what are the other abilities of other items. And then it's, can we hide items? And then you don't know if this sorcerer has the ability to do these things. There's so much you can do with magical items, and we just don't see enough. So often it's just they can cast some sort of spell or do something with magic. But tying it with an item is just something that I find personally really fascinating. And the next thing on this list is multiple magic systems. It's really common for a fantasy book to just kind of have one magic system. However, there's no rules. A really good example of this is the Kingkiller Chronicles, where we have this very soft magic system with this naming of objects and this power over them. Fascinating, loved it. And before I hear about it, yes, it's not a brand new thing that Rothfuss came up with. Naming is a concept that's gone back into folklore, and a very old term that Ursula K. Le Guin also took inspiration from. However, it's a fascinating piece of soft magic, but it's also tied to this harder magic system called Sympathy, where we kind of have the main character Kavoth, where he's able to build things with different magical abilities, and it's kind of almost this rune-based system. So not only can you have multiple magic systems, but you can have multiple magic systems completely different from one another. You can have hard systems, soft systems, all within the same world. One example of this that I've not heard many people reference it as being a progression fantasy, but in a lot of ways, the Stormlight magic systems with the Knights Radiant is kind of a progression-based fantasy. It's almost leaning into RPG, just kind of without the numbers. And this idea of kind of being able to level up with these different phrases and words of power. We have 10 different orders, each tied to one of the 10 heralds. And they each have access to their own types of spren, as well as different abilities and different ranking systems. In a way, that is kind of the one type of magic. It's not really multiple magic systems. However, there's different types of it. It's different rankings and different abilities depending on the different orders that the characters are in. But also continuing with the Stormlight example, one thing that I think Sanderson does incredibly well is tying his magic systems to his theme, plot, or character. He does an incredible job of having the sort of character arcs and the certain realizations that the characters need to come across that are tied to the magic system with these words of power. So quite often when we're coming to the end of the book, kind of the climax of the book, and everything seems lost, we have this realization, this shift in character, and these words of power that lets the main character not only complete his arc and realize something that he was wrong about, but we also tie it to this surge in power that lets him overcome the antagonist. But equally, you can do this on a smaller scale that's not quite as overt as that. You can do something that's a wee bit more subtle, where we have this magic system that's kind of connected to the character arc. So in my book, Harbinger of Justice, we have this magic system based on shadow magic and these creatures called shades. And a lot of the time, I am kind of hinting at some more mental struggles and kind of the depression and all sorts of internal struggles through the shades, because they are able to talk. You can see this creature kind of whispering things in the main character's ear. You can see how that quite easily can be tied to things like depression and things like that. And it's one of the things that I love about fantasy as a genre, is being able to take these very human themes but then kind of flesh them out into this magical sphere, but everybody kind of sees the human element to it. It's creating this visual imagery to these more ephemeral ideas that are just kind of concepts and things that we talk about into this very visceral, real element to the world. Kind of going off that, the next one is bad magic or curses. So often we see wizards that are able to throw fireballs or cast this energy and kind of defeat the villains through that. But it's rarer that we see kind of the negative magic, the kind of magic that isn't a positive thing for anybody involved, a bit like a curse. I want to see a fantasy book where the wizards are all shunned because they can't touch other people, or perhaps they have to draw their energy from this dark realm that's tied to these evil entities, and every time that they use it, there's more and more come through, and then they have to live with the demons in the real world, so they're shoved into the mountains away, living with all these horrid demons. And one of the reasons why I think that kind of idea would work really, really well and really interesting is because of this next point, which is limitations and cost. Again, this goes back to the story and the plot implications. It's way more interesting if every time a wizard throws a fireball, part of their life is worn away. They have 2 years left to live than they did a second ago. These limitations and these costs are what make the magic systems so interesting to read about. Or with something like Wheel of Time, where every time you use it, you start to go a wee bit more insane, you're less likely to use it. It's a lot more interesting than a character that can just go about and throw as many fireballs as they want. But equally, I would love to see more kind of unique limitations and costs. A lot of the time it is these characters who are losing a bit of their life force and they will die sooner, or they're going mad. But I would love to see more creative limitations and costs that are a wee bit different than what we normally get like that. Such as, perhaps they have to drain the energy away from the earth around them, so if they are too close to their homeland, then perhaps they're sucking up the energy and the soil is no longer being able to grow vegetables and their food source. Or perhaps we have a group magic system where there's a group of 3 people, and every time that one of them uses a spell, it drains a life from the other 2. Or perhaps all magic comes from this one reserve, and this reserve is also protecting humankind in this bubble of magic, and one day you start to use too much and it drains, and then these evil creatures can get in. There's so many interesting implications that you could have. They're just a wee bit more of a twist and a wee bit more unusual as a limitation rather than just madness or dying sooner. Next, we have magic systems tied to setting. A little bit like my earlier point with tying magic systems to the plot or the main character, it really is this synergy of being able to blend all these elements together and make them inextricably tied that is just really, really interesting. If you have a setting in a forest and you have this big magical tree, perhaps that's where the magic comes from, or even drawing from different types of power in different locations will give you different abilities, because it's all drawing from perhaps different fuel sources, different main magical stones that are spread out across the land. Just anything where it adds some variation, but also some limitations to the magic, but you're tying it also to the setting of the book, is just a really interesting way to make your magic system more unique. And last, but most certainly not least, we have visuals. Now, this just falls into the rule of cool. If you can have a wizard that has to swirl magic around himself and build it up before throwing it at someone, that's just a lot more interesting visually than if someone just throws a fireball at someone else. I want the magic to look like this. I want this to be in my head when I'm reading it, because at the end of the day, magic can just be cool. Magic can just make you go, hell yeah, that's sick. And a lot of that cool does come from the visual element, because not only is it just more interesting and very cool to read, but it gets stuck in your head more. If all of a sudden the necromancer has to rip into the earth and create this massive hole into this dark dimension where all these skeletons crawl out of to fight instead of just resurrecting a dead body, that's going to stick more in your head than just waving a hand over a dead body and letting them stand up. This idea of ripping a door into hell and letting these creatures crawl out to fight for you is just way more of an interesting visual. And just imagine the potential art you could get for that scene. That would be awesome. There's nothing wrong with adding elements like that just because it's cool. Now, I'm not saying that these magic system ideas don't already exist. That's why I said I wanted more of them. However, if you do have a recommendation for books that do some of these things, then please let me know down in the comments below, because I would love to check out more books like this. And a huge thank you to Loreforge for sponsoring this video. Definitely check that out in the description below. But thank you very much for watching. Outro.